All right, this is the last section in our final exam review. We're going to start with a microbe. So these are the microorganisms. And there are three ways that microorganisms can be harmful. They can actually cause an infection where once we ingest them, they actually grow and then disrupt our normal bodily functions. They can actually produce a toxin. So this is an intoxication and actually more of a true definition of food poisoning, where this toxin that released then triggers an illness. And then there's an enterotoxin, where it actually grows in the gastrointestinal tract and then produces the toxins. Now, not all microorganisms are bad, or I should say ugly. We can categorize them as good, bad, and ugly. Some microorganisms are actually good, and think about those that occur in fermented foods like kimchi or yogurt. And those help to sustain our microbial flora in our gastrointestinal tract. So we want to maintain our microbiota in our system. But there are some bad ones, and some of them just cause food spoilage. You don't have to know that Pseudomonas causes that, but you should know that not all are necessarily going to cause food poisoning. The bugs that cause food spoilage aren't necessarily the ones that are pathogenic. Pathogenic meaning causing disease, and those that produce foodborne illness. Most people think of meat as the main cause of foodborne illness, or the foods that are going to be a host to those microbial organisms. But in general, if you look at, there's poultry, 17% leafy greens, 13% beef at 12%, less than poultry. Fruit and nuts, almost as much as beef. And then we think of vine stock vegetables, even close to beef. And then we have a big category of other. So it's not just our red meat or ground beef that's going to cause foodborne illness. One of the most dangerous bugs is E. coli 0157H7. Remember, we talked about a lot of the other bugs this semester, or at least when we covered chapter 12, but this is the one I want you to know. It is a Shiga toxin, and it really only needs a few bugs, less than 10 organisms, to cause an infective dose. The infection can result in bloody diarrhea, intestinal cramping, dehydration, kidney failure, and even death. So what happens with this Shiga toxin is it binds to the blood vessel walls. Now what happens is it actually results in hemorrhage, and that's what causes the intestinal bleeding and can lead to severe hemorrhage and even death. So how do we get bacterial contamination in our food? Well, probably the most common is from animal intestines during the slaughter process. The bacteria within their intestines ends up finding its way onto our food in our kitchen. Contaminated water supplies, so this can be with the produce that we eat. Manure for fertilizer. A lot of organic products use manure for fertilizer, and this is where even organic products such as spinach or leafy greens can be contaminated. And then our own undoing to ourselves, not practicing good hygiene and not washing your hands after you leave the bathroom. And bugs in the bathroom make their way to the kitchen. So what are the food safety tips? You want to keep hot food hot, over 140 degrees. Keep cold food cold. Remember, your refrigerator is 40 degrees. This will slow the growth of bacteria, the multiplication of bacteria. The freezer is 0 degrees, so that's actually going to halt any sort of multiplying of the bacteria. You want to keep raw foods separate and make sure you're always practicing good hygiene and wash your hands. So on to flavors. Remember we talked the difference between natural and artificial flavors. A natural flavor actually does have to come from a natural, or say whole food, one of these sources. But keep in mind that if you do take some natural sources like peach pits and apricot pits, mix it with bark to make a natural flavor that you will get, in this instance, an almond flavor with a little dose of cyanide. Almost all pits have a little bit of cyanide. So this is your natural flavor. An artificial flavor would be taking banana flavor and clove oil, and that will give you almond flavor without the cyanide. And remember, this, even though this is a natural flavor, it's still made in the lab. And it's probably made by the same guy who makes this flavor, so your artificial flavor. So when you think of natural flavors, when you see that on a package, I don't want you to think that someone went, they took a peach, they squeezed out the peach juice and then used that to flavor your packaged food. It is made in a lab. It's made by a scientist, and it's really not what most of us think about when we think about nature. Also keep in mind that a natural flavors could mean anything. It could mean a number of different chemicals that are produced in a lab added to your food. Organic food and GM foods. Organic crops, so what's the definition? We need no synthetic pesticides or fertilizers, no sewer sludge, yay, no irradiation, and definitely nothing is genetically modified. When we think about the meat, they have to follow basic health and welfare standards. The animals need to have access to the outdoors. Doesn't mean they actually have to go outdoors, but they do have to have access. No antibiotics or added hormones, and 100% organic feed. Pesticides. So if you're not organic, you're going to be conventional. There's definitely going to be a lot of pesticides, about 4.5 billion pounds of pesticides used each year. These are designed to control insects, weeds, different various diseases that can kill off crops. Problems with pesticides, they are linked to birth defects and even tumors in animals. The ones that have a greater link to this actually are not allowed to be used, but there are some that do still have, many people still have concerns about them causing problems and tumors in animals. One of the big questions is how effective pesticides are, because the insects and the weeds and the diseases tend to develop resistance. So the cons, pros and cons for organic foods. If you're eating organic, you're minimizing your exposure to pesticides. And if you cannot afford organic, I still recommend eating as many fruits and vegetables as possible. It will outweigh the cons of the pesticides. But if you can choose organic, it's best to avoid the pesticides. There certainly are some benefits to the environment, and well beyond the scope of this class. The cons. As you saw in our lecture material, a lot of the major agricultural corporations own the smaller organic brands. And a lot of these produce products are shipped together. There's cross-contamination. So when you go into the grocery store, there's a good chance about a quarter of those organic foods have pesticides. If you can buy at a farmer's market, buy locally, have a CSA, then you're much better off. Also, you notice in the grocery store, a lot of the organic foods are, people don't buy them as often, so they don't get turned over as much. So they generally are limper, and they don't have as many of their phytonutrients by the time they actually get to our tables. There's certainly a higher cost. Most people just can't afford organic food. And I'm going to say they're not nutritionally superior with a question mark. There's definitely been studies shown to demonstrate that they don't have more nutrients. And I think this is on the larger scale, larger brands. If we look at the smaller grow operations, so if you think of your local farmer's market, where they're not being planted on large plots of land, and they're not in a monoculture, the nutrients, the soils haven't been depleted as much, at least with the smaller farmers. So then we could say that there is some nutritional superiority, and there's certainly more phytonutrients. So GM foods. GM foods are made with an rDNA technology, meaning that you take the one desired gene you want out of one plant and you put it into another plant. Our natural crossbreeding techniques just mix the two varieties with the hope that you get the desired gene. So it's kind of like a targeted therapy. When we look at GM food pros and cons. The pros, the GM advocates say that they can help with dwindling farmlands, medication shortages, putting nutrients into these foods, so to help with nutrient deficiencies, and even food shortages. The cons, the insects end up becoming resistant to some of these GM foods, and there tend to be a high cost to farmers because you have to buy these seeds every year. You can't replant. There's a failure to confine and some cross-pollination. So some of the native crops we might be losing because the GM genetically engineered seeds are actually getting blown into these regions, and then we're having cross-pollination, which is pretty scary because we're going to be losing some of the native crops, and then the big GM companies like Monsanto, which own their seeds, end up owning any of the technology that enters the food, so they're going to start owning the food. I think at this point we can say that there are more cons. There's a big unknown. We haven't required labeling. We don't have as many studies as we'd like to have as far as the long-term health effects on GM foods have on health. And the reality is that the big companies like Monsanto aren't addressing nutrient deficiencies or medicine shortages. Which is unfortunate because the technology is pretty amazing. But with the lack of research and with the companies that are controlling it, it's probably at a point where it's being misused. So if you go into the store, what you're going to find is that 90% of the corn and soy out there is all genetically modified, and that really gets fed to the animals. So when you look at your eggs and your meat and your milk, it's all coming from GM food. And I think we're basically in the cycle where most of the food that we have in our market right now is GM, and most people don't know it. So labeling will be the first step, and hopefully that we'll have the opportunity to vote on that again in the future, since it got shot down last time, at least in California. All right, this is the end of your final exam review.